Good evening. I'm Kathryn Smith, General Director of Madison Opera. Thank you for joining me for a preview of our upcoming production of The Anonymous Lover by Joseph Boulogne, the Chevalier de Saint-Georges. I'll start by talking about Saint-Georges' life and then look a little bit at The Anonymous Lover. When I'm done with my presentation, we'll go to your questions. If you are watching live on January 4th, please type your questions into the YouTube conversation box so I can see them. And if you type them while I'm talking, I'll see them when I get to the Q&A. If you're watching this after January 4th and have questions, feel free to email me at info@madisonopera.org. Now I'll ask the magic people to share my screen. So, Joseph Boulogne, the Chevalier de Saint-Georges, was a renowned 18th century French fencer, violinist, composer, and soldier. He was a biracial man and is considered by many the first major Black classical musician. Biographical details on his life are slim, shall we say, in places, and definitely not fully verified. I'm using as sources several French biographies, which in turn quote contemporary sources. However, those contemporary sources can be biased or simply in error, and we have nothing written by Saint-Georges himself. Further, these biographies do not agree with each other on some key details, such as dates and events, or for that matter, how to spell his name. So let's call this talk my best attempt to make it all make sense, with the disclaimer that it's entirely possible that what I'm about to say will be proven to be incorrect. So, Joseph Boulogne was born December 25th, 1745 in Basse-Terre in the French colony of Guadeloupe. Even the year of his birth is in question. Some biographies say 1745, some say 1748, and his death certificate indicated 1739, which some scholars say is mathematically impossible. For this talk, we're going with 1745. His father was Georges Boulogne, a white plantation owner. Boulogne was a commoner, but he was called de Saint-Georges after one of his plantations. Joseph's mother was a 17-year-old enslaved woman of Senegalese origin called Nanon. Decades later, when she made a will, she signed her name Anne. Boulogne was legally married, but acknowledged his son by Nanon and gave the boy his last name. 2 years after Joseph's birth, Boulogne was tried for murder following a duel. He was condemned to death, so he fled from Guadeloupe to France, a distance of around 4,000 miles. The following year, he was executed in effigy, and all of his property was confiscated. His wife took Joseph and Nanon with her to France, where they rejoined Boulogne in Bordeaux. Thanks to his brother, who was part of King Louis XV's court, Boulogne was given a royal pardon and returned to Guadeloupe with his family the next year. Joseph was now 4 years old. When he was 7, Joseph was taken to France to attend a Jesuit boarding school. 2 years later, his father and mother came to France, where they settled in Paris, as Guadeloupe was occupied by the British during the 7 Years' War. And note that slavery at this time was legal in the French colonies, but illegal in France itself. So by growing up in France, Joseph was a free man, which he would not have been in Guadeloupe. Boulogne insisted that his son receive a gentleman's education, which included fencing, horse riding, dancing, music, and more. For example, Joseph studied at the Royal Riding School in the Tuileries. The head of the school said he was one of their best students. When Joseph was 13, his father enrolled him in the Royal Fencing Academy run by Nicolas Benjamin Texier de la Beaucellier. Beaucellier's son Antoine, a classmate of Joseph's, wrote in his memoirs, "At 15, his progress was so rapid that he was already beating the best swordsmen, and at 17, he developed the greatest speed imaginable." As time went on, the public flocked to see Joseph participate in fencing exhibitions. He generally won and generally put on a good show, unless his opponents said racist things. Henry Angelo, who later ran a fencing academy in London, wrote of his friend Saint-Georges, "No professional or amateur ever showed such a high degree of precision and strength, such a long thrust, and so great a speed. His attacks were an uninterrupted sequence of blows, and his parrying was so impenetrable that one could not touch him. He was indeed the personification of energy." In 1761, a fencing master in Rouen publicly called Saint-Georges Boissellier's mulatto, saying he could easily beat him. The term mulatto was as offensive then as it is now. Urged by his father, who promised him an expensive horse and carriage if he won, the teenage Joseph went to Rouen for a match that was heavily bet on by the public. To a very real extent, it was seen as a fight between pro-slavery forces and those who believed in equality between the races. Joseph won the match. Shortly after the match, he became an officer of the king's bodyguard, essentially the first step in a noble military career. With this post came the noble title Chevalier. Joseph adopted the suffix of his father's plantation and became known as the Chevalier de Saint-Georges, which is how I'm going to refer to him going forward. Time for a pet photo. I like to scatter pet photos into my talks on the theory that everyone's life is improved by looking at cute animals. The ones I'll show tonight reside with members of our Anonymous Lover company, and this is Mabel, who lives with ensemble member Megan Gloss. In 1764, Saint-Georges' father returned to Guadeloupe, leaving Joseph and Nanon in Paris with an income that, in the words of a biographer, would enable a single person at that time to live in luxury, in a large apartment with a staff of 3 servants and a fine carriage and team with a coachman and groom. So Saint-Georges was now a well-to-do 19-year-old and lived a wonderful life in Paris society. He continued to fence daily, attended balls and salons, and so forth. His fame started to grow in other areas too, and that takes us to music. Simultaneously with fencing and riding, Saint-Georges studied music, as playing an instrument was part of being a gentleman. We don't know much about his early training, other than that it included the violin, which was a particularly fashionable instrument at the time. We believe that he studied with Francois-Joseph Gossec, a composer of symphonies and chamber music, who would later write some operas. By his early 20s, Saint-Georges' skill as a violinist was such that a number of composers wrote pieces dedicated to him. But interestingly, he wasn't performing publicly. Scholars assume he played at private salons, as other men of his class would have done. In 1769, Gossec founded an orchestra called Le Concert des Amateurs. It was one of the first independent orchestras, sponsored by several backers, rather than working for a single noble employer. The musicians were both professionals and wealthy amateurs, playing side by side. The professionals got paid, and the wealthy amateurs supported the orchestra. It was an enormous group with about 80 players compared to the more usual forces of 35 to 50, and they performed a dozen concerts a year. Saint-Georges joined the Concert des Amateurs from the beginning. At 24 years old, he was considered one of the wealthy amateurs, as he had money and no orchestra experience. Within a couple of years, though, he became the orchestra's concertmaster. He also began composing. His first composition that we know of was a set of 6 string quartets. In 1772, he premiered his first 2 violin concertos, which he performed himself, with Gossec conducting the orchestra. And here, played by our video dog, is a bit of the first movement of his first concerto. It's performed by the Bavarian Chamber Philharmonic with Yura Lee on violin. He would write 12 more violin concertos in the next 4 years. They were generally successful, but Saint-Georges was said to be appreciated not as much for his compositions as for his performances, enrapturing especially the feminine members of his audience. In 1773, Gossec took over a more established orchestra, and Saint-Georges became the conductor of the Concert des Amateurs. In addition to violin concertos, he composed symphonies concertantes, a new musical form that combined concertos and symphonies. And the orchestra thrived. One writer called it the best orchestra for symphonies in Paris and perhaps in all of Europe. Saint-Georges' father died in 1774. Although he had originally made a will leaving an annuity to Joseph, in the end, everything went to his legitimate daughter, including the funds that had been supporting Saint-Georges until now. This meant that the 28-year-old Saint-Georges now had to support himself and his mother for the first time in his life. And now we come to the Paris Opera. In early 1776, it was struggling financially and artistically. A succession of impresarios had tried to turn it into a profitable business, which is, of course, impossible with opera. A new set of backers proposed to take it over. Given his massive success at the Concert des Amateurs, Saint-Georges was their choice as its next music director. But according to a contemporary source, 3 of the opera's leading ladies publicly presented a petition to the Queen, assuring Her Majesty that their honor and delicate conscience could never allow them to submit to the orders of a biracial man. This became a scandal for the Queen, as opera was her sphere of influence. Saint-Georges withdrew his name from consideration, and the King took over operation of Paris Opera, giving it to his own staff. Scholars differ on what was really going on here, apart from the obvious racism. There were definitely elements of a backstage power struggle at the company. And note that no one ever found a way to make opera profitable. And so we bring Marie Antoinette into this picture. Born in 1755, she married the Dauphin of France when she was 14. At the time of the Paris Opera incident, she was 21 years old and had been queen for less than 2 years. In common with other aristocrats, she was very musical and held musical salons in her palaces. The audience for these was limited to her intimate circle and a few musicians, and that included Saint-Georges. We don't know details, but one scholar suggests that he would play the violin sonatas with the Queen accompanying him on the forte piano. And shortly after the Paris Opera mess, Saint-Georges started composing operas of his own. I will warn you now that almost none of his operas survive. His biographies use the word probably and likely about many things. And before we get to the opera, we have a few people to meet. Around 1777, Saint-Georges formed close ties with the House of Orléans, which was basically only one rung below the royal family itself. Their Paris estate was the enormous Palais Royal, opposite what is now the Louvre. At this time, the family's head was Duke Louis-Philippe, a patron of literature and the arts, especially theater. His son, also Louis-Philippe, will become important later in this talk. Most important at this moment was Louis-Philippe's second wife. Charlotte Jeanne Barrault de la Haye de Rieux was born into a noble family. At age 19, she married the 70-year-old Marquis de Montesson, who died 12 years later. She then became involved with the widowed Louis-Philippe, and they married in 1773. Because her rank was lower than the Duke's, the marriage was considered a secret to prevent her from taking the title of Duchess. So she was known as Madame de Montesson and described by a contemporary as a friendly person whose company was like a school for good taste and good manners. Like many aristocrats, she had a private theater where she hosted dramatic performances and concerts. Such society theaters were an important part of the art scene at the time, and her theater, which seated 500 people, was considered one of the best. A contemporary writer says that this was not only because of the standing of the actors and the distinction of the audience, but also because of the plays selected. So that included Beaumarchais' The Barber of Seville, Pergolesi's La Serva Padrona, and plays written by Madame de Montesson herself. The performers were mostly professionals, but also members of the household, including Madame de Montesson and even occasionally the Duke. There were 2 or 3 shows a week, and the most distinguished personages of Paris and the court were always to be seen pressing for admission. Meet Ling Mei, who lives with George Abbott III, one of our ensemble members. Back to Saint-Georges. His first opera was called Ernestine. The score is lost, but we know it was a comedy based on The Story of Ernestine or the Misfortunes of an Orphan Girl by Marie-Jeanne Riccoboni, which had been published 12 years earlier. The libretto was by Pierre de la Clos, then an artillery officer in his mid-30s. His literary fame would come 5 years later with Les Liaisons Dangereuses, an epistolatory novel published in 1782. Laclos received help on the Ernestine libretto from Desfontaines, the literary name for François-Georges Faulques-Deschet. Then, in the early stages of his writing career, Desfontaines would write over 70 stage works before his death in 1825. So, Ernestine premiered at Madame de Montesson's theater in spring 1777 and received applause. It then premiered publicly at the Comédie Italienne that July, attended by Marie Antoinette and members of her court. Saint-Georges conducted, as was the practice at the time. And it was a massive flop, attributed very much to the libretto, which was considered a bad adaptation of a beloved novel. The journal Le Mercure de France praised the music, saying, "One noted very agreeable duos, brilliant arias, and ensemble pieces that do Saint-Georges honor, and a display of good style, as well as knowledge, facility, and talent." Le Journal de Paris called it a failure, but said, "Several musical passages hold out the promise of a real success." Another critic. Monsieur de Saint-Georges' composition, ingenious and clever though it was, often missed its effect. There was grace and finesse, but little in the way of character or variety, and few new ideas. So a slight digression, the above passage was written by Friedrich Melchior, the Baron de Grimm, a German-born French journalist and critic. Grimm had been very supportive of Leopold Mozart's tours to Paris with his young children in the early 1760s. Over a decade later, the 22-year-old Wolfgang Mozart then stayed with Grimm for 5 months in 1778. For a couple months of that time, Saint-Georges was essentially living next door to Mozart in adjoining mansions that shared a communal garden. We can assume the two composers met each other, but remember that Saint-Georges was 10 years older than Mozart and very famous at a time that Mozart was not. Anything beyond that with regards to their relationship is pure speculation. So, Ernestine was a flop, performed only once, and Saint-Georges was now in financial trouble, as the Théâtre Italien required new composers to help front the cost of a production. So Madame de Montesson engaged him as the music director of her theater, and then convinced her husband to create a position for him as lieutenant of the hunt at their chateau outside of Paris. Remember, Saint-Georges was an accomplished horse rider, so this wasn't far-fetched. He was now officially on the Orléans staff with a double salary and an apartment within their estate. In his musical post, he conducted Madame de Montesson's concerts, performed in her productions, and composed new works. He was still conducting the Concert des Amateurs, and also worked for the Marquis and Marquise de Montalembert, who also had a theater in their home. Fittingly, his second opera was called La Chasse, The Hunt. The libretto was by Desfontaines, who had collaborated on Ernestine. After a private performance at the Montesson Theater, it premiered at the Comédie Italienne in October 1778. And it was a success. Le Journal de Paris wrote, "The public received the work with loud applause," adding, "There is every reason to encourage him to continue writing operas. The music was much appreciated and deserves to be." At her request, La Chasse was performed for Marie Antoinette at the Royal Chateau at Marly, and like Ernestine, the score is now lost. Another digression, Saint-Georges' love life. Many biographers and contemporary writers make reference to Saint-Georges having an active love life, to put it very mildly. His friend La Boissière writes, "Sought after everywhere in society, he often had music to thank for liaisons in which love was not far away. Given his lively temperament, he loved and was loved." As a wealthy young nobleman, a successful athlete, and a popular musician, he likely did have numerous affairs. Further, as interracial marriage was prohibited in France, there was no chance that he could get married. One gossip writer of the time wrote that he had an affair with the Marquise de Montalembert, for whose theater he worked. It was even rumored that they had a child, and the recent movie Chevalier took this gossip and ran with it as a fact. In May 1799, Saint-Georges was attacked by 6 men when he and a friend were returning home one night. A contemporary wrote, "Several of the killers have been arrested. Monsieur le Duc d'Orléans wrote to Monsieur le Noir to recommend to him that a striking justice be done on the culprits." After 24 hours, Monsieur le Duc was asked not to interfere in this affair, and the prisoners, who were recognized as policemen, were released, which gives rise to 1,000 conjectures. Some gossip suggested that it was the Marquis de Montalembert who arranged the attack. Other scholars believe that Saint-Georges was not the intended target. They were supposed to attack one of his friends who had had an affair with a different married woman. His fame continued to spread. John Adams, in France to negotiate support for American independence, wrote in his diary in May 1779, "Lee gave us an account of Saint-Georges at Paris. He is the most accomplished man in Europe in riding, running, shooting, fencing, dancing, music. He will hit the button, any button, on the coat or waistcoat of the greatest masters." A year later, Saint-Georges premiered his third and most successful opera, L'Amant Anonyme, The Anonymous Lover. We will come back to it. His fourth opera has a question mark to it. It's called Le Droit de Seigneur and premiered in 1784. The librettist was Beaumarchais, as in the author of The Barber of Seville and The Marriage of Figaro. All that survives is an aria published at that time in a newspaper. But according to another source, the opera was by a different composer, and Saint-Georges only wrote that one aria. So who knows? His orchestral work continued. The Concert des Amateurs had to disband in 1781 due to a lack of funding, but the Duke of Orleans' son helped Saint-Georges revive it as part of the Freemason Olympic Lodge. Renamed Le Concert Olympique, it carried on much as the Concert des Amateurs had done. Because the Queen might attend their concerts without notice, the orchestra wore court attire at all performances. A contemporary writer described them playing in embroidered suits, lace cuffs, swords at their sides, and feathered hats on the benches. Such an orchestra was a sight to behold and no less pleasant to listen to. And the orchestra commissioned Joseph Haydn to compose 6 new symphonies, which became known as the Paris Symphonies, and premiered under Saint-Georges' baton in 1786. So the music of Saint-Georges that I've discussed so far could be called serious works. They were played for subscription concerts and in private performances. The greater public, though, knew the popular songs he wrote for guitar and keyboard accompaniment. Unfortunately, only a few were published in his lifetime, so most are lost. In 1785, the Duke of Orleans died. Madame de Montesson closed her mansion and theater and retired to a convent for a year. With his patrons gone, Saint-Georges lost not only his jobs, but also his apartment. He was now 40 years old. The new Duke of Orleans, Louis-Philippe II, knew Saint-Georges well. 2 years his junior, the 2 men had practiced at the same fencing halls, and Louis-Philippe had been the one to sponsor the creation of Le Concert Olympique. He now gave Saint-Georges a flat at the Palais Royal and drew him into his political circles. Louis-Philippe wanted France to adopt the British constitutional monarchy, as opposed to the French absolute monarchy. So yes, we're about to get into politics. Brace yourselves. But first, meet Sundance, who lives with ensemble member Brian White. So the Duke was embarking on a massive reconstruction of the Palais Royal, which meant the orchestra no longer had a theater. An advisor suggested sending Saint-Georges to London, as George, the Prince of Wales, wanted to meet him. So at this time, his father, King George III, was ill, and it was assumed that the prince would soon become king. That didn't actually happen for another 35 years. Louis-Philippe hoped to gain Prince George's support for himself as France's constitutional monarch. So in spring 1787, Saint-Georges went to London, staying with 2 fencing masters. They arranged exhibition matches for him, including one at Carlton House for the Prince of Wales. The 25-year-old prince sparred with the 41-year-old Saint-Georges, as well as watching the other matches. One of these was with La Chevalière d'Aillon. another interesting person to meet. Charles d'Eon de Beaumont was a French diplomat, spy, and soldier. He fought in the 7 Years' War, spied for France in Russia and England, and was made the Chevalier d'Eon in 1763. Starting in 1777, at age 49, d'Eon lived as a woman. Calling herself Charlotte, she was officially recognized as a woman by both the French and English governments, one of the earliest instances of legal recognition of a gender transition. Saint-Georges had fenced with the Chevalier d'Eon in Paris years earlier, and now re-met her as the Chevalier d'Eon. This painting shows the prince and his entourage watching the match, with the Chevalier scoring a hit, giving rise to rumors that Saint-Georges allowed it in deference either to her age or to her gender. Saint-Georges also performed music while in London, and Mather Brown painted this portrait of him. Back in Paris by late spring, he wrote his next opera, La Fille Garçon, which premiered in 1787. It was a comedy about a boy who was raised as a girl and what happens when he falls in love. Yet again, the problem was the libretto, with critics writing, the piece was sustained only by the music of Monsieur de Saint-Georges. And yet again, the score is lost. Meanwhile, the Duke had opened several new theaters at the Palais Royal. The smallest was a marionette theater called Théâtre Beaujolais, in which opera singers provided the voices for the puppets. For this theater, Saint-Georges wrote Aline and Dupré, or the Chestnut Vendor, and that is literally all we know about it. And now we get to the French Revolution. If there are any French historians watching, I'm sorry. So in broad terms, Louis-Philippe was a supporter of the revolution. He wanted a constitutional monarchy with himself as the head. And now we re-meet Laclos, one-time librettist of the opera Ernestine and author of Les Liaisons Dangereuses. He became Louis-Philippe's secretary, helping promote him as an alternative to the highly unpopular King Louis XVI. In spring 1789, in an attempt to deal with France's growing financial problems, the 35-year-old king summoned an assembly representing the three estates, which were the clergy, the first estate, the nobility, the second estate, and the commoners, largely magistrates and lawyers, who comprised the third estate. The Estates General opened on May 5, 1789. According to biographers, Saint-Georges attended, standing in the back with Laclos. The assembly did not work, to put it mildly. The Bastille fell on July 14, 1789, officially starting the French Revolution. In late August, the assembly declared equal rights for all French people. Shortly thereafter, Saint-Georges stopped using the title Chevalier. Earlier in August, Laclos sent Saint-Georges to London on a second mission to stay close to the Prince of Wales. The prince took him fencing, fox hunting, and to the races. Later that fall, Louis-Philippe also came to London, where he became the prince's regular companion. So Louis-Philippe was sent to London for political reasons that are too complicated to explain, but involve both the king and the Marquis de Lafayette. He returned to France after a year, and in 1792 renamed himself Philippe Égalité, renaming the Palais Royal the Palais Égalité. Back to Saint-Georges. In addition to working for Louis-Philippe, many scholars believe he was involved in anti-slavery activities both in London and in France. But because this would have been in secret, there is zero consensus as to what he did or did not do. At some point on this trip to London, he was attacked again. A man armed with a pistol demanded his purse. The Chevalier disarmed the man, but when 4 more rogues hidden until then attacked him, he put them all out of commission. Monsieur de Saint-Georges received only some contusions, which did not keep him from going that night to play music in the company of friends. Some claim that this was an assassination attempt intended to put an end to his abolitionist activities. His time in London brought expensive hotel bills, so the next summer he agreed to a fencing match with a man who, it is believed, paid Saint-Georges to throw the match, or at least to make it appear that they were equals. The next day, Saint-Georges returned to France. He landed in the city of Lille in northern France, near the Belgian border. He participated in a fencing tournament there in July 1790, and a newspaper wrote, "Though ill, he fought with that grace that is his trademark. Lightning is no faster than his arms, and in spite of running a fever, he demonstrated astonishing vigor." His illness got worse, sending him to bed for almost 2 months. While still bedridden, he composed a one-act opera dedicated to the citizens of Lyon. Guillaume Toucourt, William Allhart, or The Village of Friends, premiered there that year. The newspaper wrote, "The music by Saint-Georges is full of sweet warmth of emotion and spirit. The public made the hall resound with its justly deserved applause." This would be Saint-Georges' last opera and is completely lost. And he was now 44 years old. That September, he joined the National Guard and started to make a life for himself in Lyon. He built another orchestra, which according to an article gave a concert every week. Saint-Georges' position as a captain of the National Guard and his ties to the House of Orléans meant he was essentially on the side of the revolution, a fact which came to a head when he and some fellow musicians tried to give a concert in Tournai, across the border from Lyon in Belgium. Many French refugees, meaning nobles who had fled the revolution, were waiting things out in Belgium, and Saint-Georges was advised to leave town quickly. It is said that the dining room of the hotel where this French citizen was staying had the impertinence to refuse to serve him, and yet he remained perfectly calm. In summer 1791, a rumor circulated that he died in a pistol fight, so he published a letter announcing he was not dead. Next, meet Opera Owl, who travels with production stage manager Lynn Finnicky all around the world, including, as you can see, to Overture Hall. In April 1792, France declared war against Austria, which meant the Holy Roman Empire and encompassed present-day Belgium, Germany, the Netherlands, and more. The commander of Lille was ordered to attack Tournai, only to be met by massive Austrian fire. The National Guard, led by Saint-Georges, held the line near the Belgian border. That September, the National Assembly authorized the formation of a volunteer legion from the French West Indies and southern France. Officially called the Free Legion of the Americas and the South, it was soon referred to as the Légion de Saint-Georges, after its leader, who was now the first black colonel in the French army. One of Saint-Georges' biographers describes the unit as probably the first all non-white military unit in Europe. The Austrians started to bombard Lille in September 1792. Saint-Georges' regiment helped defend it. His regiment was generally successful, but there were issues with it being given enough funds. He initially had a troop of 400 foot soldiers and 200 cavalrymen, and simply getting them all supplied took a lot of effort. His bravery and leadership were recounted many times. According to reports from his men, Saint-Georges made it a point of honor to lead his troops into battle, even pursuing the enemy farther than had been requested. In 1793, the French general Charles-François Dumouriez, who had led an attack on the Austrians about 100 miles from Lille, became fed up with the French government, which had recently executed King Louis XVI. Dumouriez planned to march to Paris, dissolve the current government, and put in a constitutional monarchy. As one step in his plan, Dumouriez sent General Joseph Mieszynski to seize Lille on April 2nd. The city was successfully defended by Saint-Georges, and Mieszynski was arrested. 2 days later, Dumouriez defected to the Austrian army. Going with him was Louis Philippe, the son of Philippe Égalité. As for Mieszynski, he was tried by the Revolutionary Tribunal, with Saint-Georges being called as a witness against him. He was found guilty and executed. At the same time, various accusations were being leveled against Saint-Georges. His home was searched in May 1793, and books were found belonging to Philippe Égalité and to Dumouriez. Over the spring, he was accused of misusing government funds, and his legion was disbanded. On September 25th, 1793, he was suspended from his regiment. Some say that he was arrested. Only a couple weeks earlier, a law had passed that authorized the imprisonment of vaguely defined suspects. One historian points out that Saint-Georges could have been arrested for any number of crimes. As a chevalier, he belonged to the nobility. He was friends with the Prince of Wales, an enemy of France, and he had of course consorted with Marie Antoinette, Louise Égalité, and others who were now awaiting trial. So yes, this is the start of the Reign of Terror, during which approximately 17,000 people were executed and another 10,000 died in prison without trial. Among those executed in the coming months were Philippe Égalité, and even Madame de Montesson was thrown into prison for over a year. Around the time Philippe Égalité was executed, Saint-Georges was sent to a military prison. There is no record of a trial, and he was never told what the charges were. After the Reign of Terror ended, Saint-Georges' friends and colleagues started rallying for his release, sending petitions and letters to the government. He was finally released in October 1794, now age 48. At his request, he was reinstated in the army that May, but not given an official assignment or allowed to rejoin his regiment. He wrote to the authorities that summer, "My devotion to the revolution is known in the entire Republic. Torn by so many undeserved persecutions, I find myself at last in a time when I cannot be refused the bright light of justice, when the most ardent of all my wishes is only to continue to serve my country, to offer it the last drop of my blood. Would you then, citizen deputies, not order my reintegration into the regiment which I commanded?" But after months of political maneuvering, he was ordered to stay away from his former regiment completely. His military career was over, and he had to live on an officer's half pay. That October, a slimmed-down French government called the Directory came into place, appointing Napoleon Bonaparte as commander of the interior. And that December, Saint-Georges' mother died. Meet Indy, who lives with Stephen Kemp, the scenic designer of our production. Back to music, which Saint-Georges had never given up. A new orchestra was being formed called the Circle of Harmony. Like the old Concert Olympique, it was part of a Masonic lodge, performing in what was now called the Palais Égalité. They gave 2 concerts in April 1797. Le Mercure wrote, "The concerts under the direction of the famous Saint-Georges left nothing to be desired as to the choice of pieces or the superiority of their execution." More concerts took place a year later. Around this time, Saint-Georges became ill. A contemporary writes, "Saint-Georges felt the onset of the disease of the bladder, and given his usual negligence, paid it little attention. He even kept secret an ulcer, source of his illness. Gangrene set in." One of the officers of the Legion Saint-Georges took his former colonel to his home, taking care of him until he died on June 9, 1799, age 53. He was buried in a cemetery next to the Sainte-Marguerite Church in Paris. That November, Napoleon overthrew the Directory and declared himself First Consul of France. In 1802, he re-established slavery in French colonies. Saint-Georges' reputation lasted in France, mostly for his fencing skills and military feats. His music, though, largely disappeared. Some sources say his music was legally banned because he was biracial. Other scholars point out that musical tastes were simply changing. As new music by Beethoven, Schubert, and Chopin came into public favor, that of the 18th century was considered old-fashioned. His legend carried on, too. Roger de Beauvoir wrote a largely fictional novel called Le Chevalier de Saint-Georges in 1840, and it was turned into a theatrical version that was called A Comedy Mixed with Songs. Various friends and colleagues published memoirs in the 19th century that discuss him, and Alexandre Dumas, whose father served in the Légion Saint-Georges, mentions him in his novels. A square was named after him in Guadeloupe, and in 2001, a Paris street was renamed Rue de Chevalier de Saint-Georges, noting him as a musician and orchestra conductor, captain of the National Guard of Lille, and colonel of the Legion of the Americas and the South. And his music still lasts above all. Many pieces are lost, particularly the operas and the songs, but the violin concertos and symphony concertants still exist and can be heard in many chamber music concerts around the world. So meet Gracie and Frankie, who live with Michelle Rofrano, who is conducting The Anonymous Lover with us. And so now let's talk about The Anonymous Lover. First, the story of the opera, which is set at the country estate of Leontine, a wealthy young widow. Since there have not been many productions of this opera, I'm going to illustrate with Madison Opera's designs. We meet Valcourt, who tells us he has been in love with Leontine for years. With the help of their mutual friend Ophémane, Valcourt has been showering Leontine with anonymous gifts and love letters. Ophémane tells Valcourt that it is finally time to reveal his secret. Valcour is unsure, as he is from a slightly lower social class than Leontine. Leontine enters with her friend Dorothée and asks Valcour's advice. The anonymous lover has sent Leontine a bouquet of flowers, along with a letter asking her to carry it publicly. Valcour convinces her to do so. Jeanette and Colin, a young peasant couple, thank Leontine for making their wedding possible, singing a song about love and joy. It turns out that these festivities were put on by the anonymous lover to entertain Leontine. Later that evening, Valcour reflects on his love for Leontine, and separately, Leontine laments that Valcour is unlikely to understand her growing feelings for him. Offenbach tells Leontine that he has spoken to the anonymous lover, who wishes to finally reveal his identity. Leontine agrees to the meeting. Valcour arrives, explaining that he's just there to check up on her as a friend, but the two finally confess their love for each other. Valcour reveals that he is the anonymous lover, and everything ends happily ever after. It's not the deepest or most complicated of plots, even by opera standards. And because it's rarely performed, there are not a lot of clips I could have played, but here are two concert excerpts. This is from Leontine's aria, L'amour devient propice, in which she sings about being in love with Valcour. It's sung by Sonia Headlam with Apollo's Fire. Next is a trio sung by Leontine, Valcour, and Offenbach after all has been revealed and they are sorting out their feelings. This is an opera ritrovata performance sung by Amanda Keenan, John Lee Keenan, and E. Scott Levine. So, what do we know about the Anonymous Lover's composition process and premiere? Truthfully, really not a lot, but let's look at what we do know. We're going back to before the French Revolution, when Saint-Georges is a renowned fencer and violinist, head of the Concert des Amateurs, and resident composer for Madame de Montesson. But before that, we have to talk about the nature of French opera itself, which was changing at this time. In the early 1700s, operas tended to be about gods and mythic heroes. But with the Enlightenment came an evolution into operas that were about more normal people. Rousseau proclaimed that music must approach nature, and even composed his own opera, The Village Soothsayer, which was hailed as a new art form. It was so popular, it was performed at the wedding of the future King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Meet Rye and Swiss, two of the three cats living with Scott Gendel, our principal coach and music arranger. His third cat is, of course, named Ham. So, L'amant anonyme, the anonymous lover, is set among ordinary-ish people, essentially in the modern day. It is called in some sources a comédie mêlée d'ariettes, which means a comedy mixed with ariettas, an arietta just being a short aria, basically. The title page of the score is called a comedy in two acts mixed with ballets. It is also classified as an opera comique, which basically means there is extensive spoken dialogue in between numbers rather than sung recitative. This is very similar to the German Singspiel form that was also popular at this time. An example of the Singspiel is Mozart's The Abduction from the Seraglio, written 2 years after The Anonymous Lover, or His Magic Flute. The Anonymous Lover is based on a play of the same name by Félicité de Genlis. Caroline Stephanie Félicité, Madame de Genlis, was at the time in her mid-30s and governess to the daughters of the Duke of Chartres, the current Duke of Orleans' son, the one who would become known as Philippe Égalité during the Revolution. She and the Duke had also been lovers for a brief period of time. And she was the niece of Madame de Montesson, which is how she became connected to the House of Orleans. In later years, she became known for her theories about education, wrote over 100 books, and she's really worth reading about because she's fascinating in a lot of ways. It's assumed that her play L'Amant Anonyme was first performed at Madame de Montesson's theater, where Saint-Georges would have seen it and decided to set it to music. The opera's libretto was by Desfontaines, who 1 year earlier had written the libretto for La Chasse, Saint-Georges' second opera. We know nothing about the premiere, other than that it took place on March 8, 1780. Scholars say it was probably at Madame de Montesson's theater. We do not know who sang the leading roles, but it is believed that the aristocratic role of Dorothée, which is a non-singing role, was played by Madame de Montesson herself. She would have been about 42 years old at this time. We do know the opera was considered a success, but not really what happened to it after that, i.e. whether there were additional performances elsewhere in France. You see, the reality about operas and any literature is that they only survive if the physical scores do. Pieces of paper are highly subject to being destroyed, either accidentally or on purpose. One of Saint-Georges' biographers writes, "It seems that, along with practically all of Saint-Georges' scores left in manuscript, many of his vocal pieces were destroyed during the Revolution, or might, for all we know, be moldering in the basement of some provincial archive." Which means there's a possibility we will find more music by Bellone at some point. Around 2020, the Scholars of Opera Ritrovata, a small company of musicians, published a version of The Anonymous Lover, including orchestra parts. In their editor's notes, they say that the only source for the music was an undated manuscript at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. The manuscript contained many inconsistencies, such as omitting accidentals, flats and sharps, and even omitting the notes altogether on one chorus number. Opera Ritrovata's score enables companies like Madison Opera to perform this piece. And indeed, in the past few years, there have been productions at least 5 American companies, with more planning it in the coming year. So this is, of course, Madison Opera's first production of it. It is directed by Stephanie Havey, who directed Orpheus in the Underworld with us in 2022, and conducted by Michelle Grafrano in her debut with us. The set is designed by Stephen Kemp and is basically variations of the garden outside Leontine's home. And this is a video Stephen created of his scenic designs. The costumes are designed by Karen Brown Larimore, Madison Opera's resident costumer, and look like this. So in period, very beautiful. Our costume shop right now is absolutely gorgeous to look at. As to the piece itself, our first decision was to perform the dialogue in English rather than French, so there is a more natural speaking rhythm between the performers. We've made some cuts. In French operas of that period, it was the norm to have almost as much dance as singing. We are cutting it down to 2 dances, a country dance when Colin and Jeanette first appear, and a more stately dance for the entire company at the end of the opera. Choreography is by Lisa Thurell, co-artistic director of Canopy Dance. Since The Anonymous Lover is not very long, it will run about 90 minutes without an intermission, we are adding a few pieces of music to both develop the plot and to let all of you hear a little more of Saint-Georges' music. As an orchestral interlude, we are inserting the Largo from his violin concerto in D major, opus 2. This was one of the first pieces he composed, performed with the Concert des Amateurs in 1772. We've interpolated the only surviving aria from Ernestine, his first opera, and given it to the character of Valcour. This required changing a few proper nouns and changing the key to be suitable for a tenor instead of a soprano. And then we added a little song called Deux Amours for Dorothée, so that she is now a singing part of this world. And I need to thank the amazing Scott Gandel, Madison Opera's principal coach, who created all of the arrangements of these interpolations. Leontine is sung by Keely Footerer in her debut with us. She has sung with Glimmerglass Opera and Minnesota Opera, among others. Valcour is sung by David Blaylock, who has sung with us several times since his debut as Giacchino in Fidelio. David lives in Madison and sings regularly at the Metropolitan Opera. Ophaman is sung by Yazid Gray, who debuted with us as Sam in Trouble in Tahiti last season. He is sung with the Pittsburgh Opera and Glimmerglass Festival, among others. The other three principals are members of our Studio Artist program. Jeanette is sung by Brianna Murray, Dorothea is sung by Haley Cohen, and Colin is sung by William Johnson. We also have 6 ensemble members who fill out the company as Leontine's friends and household staff. And the women get those fabulous dresses. So now let's go back to the start of The Anonymous Lover. This is a bit of the overture as performed by the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. So a final pet photo before we go to questions. If you've seen my previous talks, you have met Archie before. He is the new puppy residing with Chloe Agostino, our patron services manager. He's grown considerably in the past few weeks, as you can see. Come watch my next talk in March and you'll see how fast a puppy can grow. So now let's go to questions. If you're watching this on January 4th, please type your questions into the YouTube conversation box so I can see them. If you're watching afterwards, feel free to send me questions at info@madisonopera.org. Okay, sorry, just scroll up. If Joseph were to write an opera today, what would it be about? Really impossible sort of to know. One of the real issues, we've got nothing about what he thought about what he wrote. You know, most composers, you know why they wrote stuff. The Anonymous Lover, some people want to say, well, it's clearly about his struggles as a lover. I'm like, no, it was a play written by the niece of his patron that had been performed at her theater. So my guess is he would find I think he mostly wrote comedies. He'd find a funny play and set it. What he might have done 20 years later, I don't know. And unfortunately, we won't know. How many music critics did Saint-Georges end up dueling? Surprised more composers don't take up this hobby. No clue. I will say there's no record of him actually hurting someone in a duel. The kind of fencing they were doing was basically like playing racquetball, only with, sharp things. Hi, Harry. How is it that so much about Saint-Georges' life is known, including his musical activities, and yet the scores of so much of his music is lost? He was extremely famous as part of why, and he was like legendary, which is what's weird reading some of this stuff is it just doesn't agree with each other. The things his friends published in the 19th century are far-fetched. Some of them have him going to Haiti after the French Revolution. That's not verified by anything. So on the one hand, we know a lot about him, and on the other hand, we really, really don't, including how old he was. As for his music, I actually believe most of his major works are available if we go get them. The operas are not, and operas, of course, are more complicated. The songs are not, which is really too bad. But it sounds like all the violin concertos and the chamber music could be played, and really kind of should be. It sounds fabulous. And I think a related question from Harry. It seems strange that so much of Mozart's work has been preserved and so little of Saint-Georges'. What might explain this? Couple things. One, Mozart wrote a lot more music than Saint-Georges. I mean, Mozart was an amazing musician, but he also just composed nonstop from the time he was like 7. Saint-Georges kind of composed a little in a period of his life. As far as we know, he didn't really write much once the French Revolution started. When he went back to music. It was back to playing. It wasn't back to composing. We think, again, who knows? I could be totally wrong. Also, Mozart had a wife who was committed to preserving his music and making sure his pieces got published. It's the publication of music that enables it to continue. If it's just pieces of paper that get thrown away, we don't have them. Much more modern example, there are musicals by Cole Porter that we don't have music from because the musicians didn't keep them in the 1920s and paper disintegrates. This is just a comment, but I agree. St. George's life story would make a good opera. Yeah, especially I like to see the French Revolution part. The Chevalier movie stuff was just about his love life, and who cares? And find how long did Scott take to arrange this version of the opera? So what Scott arranged, to be clear, was not the whole opera. When we added Deux Amours for Dorothée, that's actually written for harpsichord. So Scott picked a good key for our singer and then orchestrated it. The Ernestine aria, he picked a good key for the tenor and then changed the orchestration and made some cuts. And then I think the violin concerto is fine as is. So he didn't do the whole thing, but there are a few pieces that we were literally like, I don't want to put a harpsichord on stage. Could you give us an orchestration? And Scott's brilliant, so he did. Hi, Pete. Lovely, thank you. As a general director, what factors do you consider when deciding to perform a relatively unknown work, at least as compared to the big ones? Same capacity and everything. Do I find it interesting? I mean, obviously, once the score got published, we all started hearing about it. And once you hear about it, you can listen to it and say, this is pretty. I mean, it is, again, not a deep, dramatic story. This is not Fellow Travelers. But it's a charming piece, and you listen to it and think, yeah, we should do that. So we're doing it. I mean, and again, I have to say Karen Brown Laramore's costumers are so pretty. It is going to be such a pretty production. Okay, so again, I'm going to drive this preview to a close. Thank you for joining me. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope we will see you for Anonymous Lover in a few weeks. Night. Thank you.